Okay, so what is this subject? First of all, because we are here in Hong Kong and I'm coming from Europe, but also because it's interesting to make a comparison between the attitude of the EU and China on the fight of illegal fishing, because the EU and China have in common the same characteristics. They have a distant water fishing fleet. You can find vessels from the EU and from China all along the world. It's different, for instance, with the United States, which has not such a distant water fleet. And also, I will do it, as you know, I'm a lawyer, I will do it from the point of view of international law. A remark, I will talk of EU vessels. Also, there is no EU flag. In the EU system, flagging of the vessels remains a competence of the member states. But as I said yesterday, within the institutional system of the EU, the competence for fisheries is an exclusive competence of the EU. And for that reason, it's justified to speak about EU vessels. And so for a lawyer, this subject is interesting because it's interesting to see what are the legal tools which are adopted at international level to fight illegal fishing, and what are the positions of the EU or China about them. I will not make a comparison between the degree of compliance of China or EU with these rules. That would be another subject, and that would be better and easier addressed by scientists who work on fisheries management and assessing data. And as a lawyer, I'm not strong about that, of course. A reminder on international law. So the specificity of international law is that there is no central authority. All states are sovereign states, either they are big or small, and consequence, to be bound by an international rule of law, a state must give its express consent. This is done through a treaty. And another remark for our subject, it's interesting to distinguish between flag state, coastal state, port state, or market state, but each of these states can encompass more than one, even of these four characteristics. And the EU and the United States are, the EU and China are in the same time coastal state, flag state, port state, and market state. And a question, I put that as a question, what is illegal fishing? It's because since yesterday morning you have heard the expression IUU for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. This expression is very much used, but for a lawyer, this is a very strange, very puzzling expression, because you put some three things which have nothing to do together. When something is unregulated, so it's not illegal for a fisherman, for instance. And at the origin of its use, this expression had absolutely no legal signification. But it has now, unfortunately, acquired such a value, in particular since 2009, when it was used in the FAO State Measures agreement, which was adopted under the auspices of the FAO. And in reality, even in its title, this convention has the term IUU. It addresses, in fact, illegal fishing only. And so keep in mind, when usually we talk about IUU, even in legal instruments, in reality, it's about illegal fishing. And concerning unreported and unregulated fishing and unregulated fishing, this issue addresses the issue of poorly regulated fisheries. And this issue concerns, first of all, states directly or through regional fisheries management organizations. And that would be another subject, because here, so the subject of today, it's illegal fishing. And the issue is then how to combat the existence of this illegal fishing, of the infringements, and what the states concerned should do about that. And so, as I said, my communication is about the legal tools which are aimed at combating these infringements and are set out in international law. First, the general framework, which is given by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which has been both ratified by the EU and China. Both are bound by the obligations set out in it. In the high seas, according to Article 94, the flag state must exercise its jurisdiction over vessels flying its flag. And this article provides also that all states have a duty to cooperate with each other to take the measures necessary for the conservation of fisheries resources, in particular through the establishment of regional fisheries management organizations. Second, in the economic exclusive zones of third countries, according to Article 62 of UNCLOS, the coastal state has sovereign rights for the management of the resources occurring in its waters. And this article provides that the coastal state has the responsibility to adopt the necessary laws and regulations, including for enforcement. But this primary responsibility of the coastal state doesn't release the other states, namely the flag states, from their obligations. And the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea has issued an advisory opinion on that question in 2015 at the request of an intergovernmental organization composed of West African countries. And that tribunal stated that the flag state has an obligation of due diligence to prevent illegal fishing by vessels flying its flag in the EEZs of third countries. This means that the flag state has the obligation to monitor the activities of their vessels, included when they are fishing in waters under jurisdiction of third countries. Beyond UNCLOS, also within the general framework, there are three international conventions, two adopted and under the framework of the FAO and one within the United Nations. And here there is a strong difference between the EU and China, because the EU has ratified these three agreements and China none of them. There is first the FAO compliance agreement, which dates from 1993. This exact title is the agreement to promote compliance with international conservation and management measures by fishing vessels on the high seas, and we usually call it the compliance agreement. This agreement describes more in details what is laid down in UNCLOS, what the flag state must do to exercise effectively its responsibilities. In particular, a a party to this agreement has the duty to grant a specific authorization before a vessel is going fishing in the high seas, and it must maintain a record of these fishing vessels with a possible derogation for vessels under 24 meters. This agreement entered into force in 2003 and now has 40 contracting parties. The second one I will mention is the United Nations Fish Stock Agreement from 1994. And it was adopted within the framework of the United Nations and is, as such, an implementing agreement of UNCLOS. Its title is the Agreement for the Implementation of UNCLOS relating to the conservation and management of straddling fish stocks and highly migratory fish stocks. And we usually call it the Fish Stocks Agreement. And it describes in a comprehensive way the duties of flag states for the conservation and management of these stocks, either on the high seas or in the EEZs. And for the high seas, it has also set out provisions for cooperation in the enforcement of conservation and management measures, in particular through RFMOs. And for that configuration, it has also defined basic procedures for boarding and inspection in the high seas. It entered into force in 2001 and has now 89 contracting parties. And the third one is a FAO Port State Measures Agreement, which was adopted in 2009 and which was the agreement adopted to fight illegal fishing. In its title, there is the expression IUU, illegal, unreported, and unregulated, but as I said, that must be interpreted as illegal only. It has entered into force 2 years ago, on the 5th June of 2016. I was present in this at the negotiations of this agreement. At that time, I was working at the EU. I was a member of the EU delegation. And from what I remember, so the EU was one of the more proactive delegations in these negotiations. And China was present also, but from what I remember, China didn't show an active role. China didn't oppose the work of these negotiations, but from what I remember, always it expressed rather rarely its position, and China gave the impression to be interested firstly to see whether this agreement will represent any trouble of any kind for its vessels, but not really interested in the general objective of this agreement. So that this, with the fact that China has not ratified the other two agreements, so the FAO Compliance Agreement and the UN Fish Stock Agreement, the question is, for me as a lawyer and as observer, so how can we interpret this approach of China when comparing in particular the fact that China is very active in the meetings of the regional fisheries management organizations? So I don't know really, but I can only make an assumption. It looks like China is first of all interested in forums where it needs to support its fishing industry, as in the RFMOs, but hasn't shown much interest up to now in forums where global issues are tackled. And so such a different approach for me looks worrying. And it's worrying because China, as it was already said, it's a big player in the world. It's the country which has the most important fleet, and in particular distant water fleet in the world. And there is need to cooperate and debate for China with the other countries. And in these RFMOs, as I said, China is, as the EU is member of many of them, and generally speaking, in the RFMOs, the EU is usually in a leading position to adopt measures against illegal fishing. And for instance, the EU has advocated and advocates very strongly for the establishment of catch documentation schemes. With these schemes, a catch certificate must accompany any batch of fish caught within the framework of the RFMO considered, and there is then a traceability of the product, and this system concretely deters illegal fishing. Such schemes have been established up to now in the CAMLA CCMLR, which is the RFMO which manages fishing in the Antarctic. It has been established for toothfish, and also it has been established in the ICAT, which is the RFMO which manages tuna in the Atlantic and Mediterranean Sea. And comparatively to the EU, China doesn't have the same proactive attitude. No, I went too quickly. A word about the bilateral agreements. According to Article 62 of UNCLOS, coastal states can give access to fishing to other states through agreements or arrangements. And a characteristic of the countries where Chinese or EU vessels are going fishing is that very often, if not always, these third countries do not have the means to control what these fleets are exactly doing. It has been demonstrated through the scientific literature or by on-site investigations made by NGOs that illegal fishing is rather frequent in these waters. And it has been recognized that the lack of transparency in these agreements or arrangements make easier for the vessels to fish beyond what they are authorized to do. And in other words, when there is no transparency, that favors hiding illegal fishing. And about this lack of transparency, this has been now mentioned since 2016 in the annual resolution on sustainable fisheries, which is adopted every year by the General Assembly of the United Nations. On this issue, this resolution reads as follows, so I quote, "The General Assembly encourages greater transparency regarding fishing access agreements, including by making them publicly available, subject to confidentiality requirements." This resolution is not a full binding requirement for the members of the United Nations. It's what we call soft law only. But this said, it shows that this lack of transparency in these bilateral agreements will be more and more under scrutiny at international level in the next years. And here on this issue, there is really a strong difference between the EU and China. For the EU, the bilateral agreements are all published in the official journals. They are very detailed, and you know the number of vessels which will be authorized. There are provisions on the catch declarations, on the control to be made, etc., etc. And with these details, it's easier for the scientists or for the civil societies, the NGOs, to make investigations and to detect possible illegal fishing. By contrast, for China, the agreements are usually made directly between the fishing companies and the third country concerned, and the terms of these agreements are not disclosed. I know only one case when it was disclosed. It was not voluntary. It was through a leak. It's the agreement with Mauritania, and this agreement with Mauritania shows that which was an agreement for 25 years, and it was signed in 2010, and there is, for instance, no indication of the maximum of vessels authorized, of the species authorized, of the quantities. We know nothing. So there is really a strong difference about this transparency, which becomes an issue which now. And another forum is the WTO. It's about the subsidies. This issue has already been raised yesterday and this morning. I will not go in depth about that. And I will just say on this issue that there has been, at the last session of negotiations within the WTO, which was last November or December, that the positions of the EU and China were very different. The EU advocated for very strong measures, and for China, what their proposal was rather, I must say, void of sense. This contradicts, by the way, what was said this morning, and I was very surprised to hear what are the measures adopted by China. I don't put into question what was said, but it seems that the position taken internally by China doesn't match what was the proposal which was put forward by China within the WTO. So if you want to have some details about that, it's easy. You go on the WTO website, you will find as working documents the position of both the EU and China, and we'll compare. It's really completely different. And for this fight against illegal fishing at international level, the EU has taken unilateral action. In 2008, it adopted a regulation with the objective of prohibition of importation of fisheries products coming from illegal fishing. For that purpose, any imported fishery product may enter the EU territory only if it's accompanied by a catch certificate, which is signed by the master of the vessel and validated by an authority of the flag state. And in addition to that, the EU may take measures against states which refuse to cooperate in the fight against illegal fishing. For instance, if there is a proof of recurrent illegal fishing by vessels of these states, and in that case, the EU may prohibit unilaterally any import from the country concerned. That hasn't been challenged up to now before the WTO. But the EU has taken measures against several states. Even if this regulation has not been challenged before the WTO. This regulation and its enforcement measures have been very scrutinized and also criticized. Myself, I could also make some critiques. I've wrote some articles about that, but that would be another long subject. But this says the EU has done it, and I think has the merit of having done it, because I think that it has had some effect against illegal fishing. So as a conclusion, it's not because a state or an organization like the EU is bound by a convention that it always complies with the rules of question. Of course, in international law, there is often non-compliance. However, to see as the EU is bound by many conventions, it gives a clue on its will to comply with these conventions. On the contrary, China has not ratified some of these conventions, as I showed. These three conventions, three global conventions: the FAO Compliance Agreement, the FAO Port State Measures Agreement, and the UN Fish Stocks Agreement. But all this said, I would like to finish on a less pessimistic vision for China with two findings. Very recently, according to Greenpeace, China has taken very strong measures against fishing companies having violated fishing rules in Africa, and some companies lost their certificates for distant water fishing. This NGO, so Greenpeace, cannot be suspected of being indulgent towards China, because and by the way, Greenpeace is not indulgent towards the EU. But I really found striking to read the heading of a press release of Greenpeace that was last March, saying the heading of that press release was "A new era is opening." So, and Greenpeace, in the article, in the development of that press release, expressed its satisfaction about the new attitude of China. So is it a turning point in China's attitude? It would mean that China is becoming aware of the need to join the fight against illegal fishing, and hopefully it will be confirmed. We will see. And in this sense, we could hope that China becomes aware that it's also in its interest to become party to the legal instruments adopted within the framework of the FAO or the United Nations, with the aim at enhancing cooperation with other states. And the second finding is about the CITES Convention, the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, which has been ratified by China. And this last year, I've observed that Chinese customs have seized species which are for which the trade is prohibited by CITES. There are two cases. So I've seen that shark fins were seized by customs here in Hong Kong, or also I think in continental China. So shark fins coming from sharks for which trade is forbidden. And also China and Hong Kong have seized the glass eels coming from Europe. The European glass eel is an endangered species, is classified as critically endangered. and there is a fight against the exportation, which is prohibited. And so these two examples shows for me the need to collaborate at international level for such issues, and it shows that it becomes a shared idea also now in China. So I hope that it will also develop for broader fisheries issues, and so that it's needed that we have also China on board to combat illegal fishing and to have healthy stocks all around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have time for questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Very informative and thoughtful. I have a question regarding Africa. You mentioned the leak of the agreement between China and Mauritania.
Yeah.
Is there a relationship between this leak and the crackdown decided by the Chinese government on illegal fishing in Africa?
According to what I remember from the press release, it's possible. Huh? But I'm not sure.
So what is the main reason for China to start adopting all these changes? The main reason, the motive for China to start adopting all these changes about illegal fishing? There must be a utilitarian motive, like for trading, for keeping relationship with other countries, or pure conservation.
I could make assumptions, but as a lawyer, for me it's so difficult because so I don't know what is in the backside of. It's a question of policy of China, and this I don't know. Really.
Do we need an explanation for somebody to behave properly or to behave improperly? What is the default assumption? That country behave, and you need to explain when they don't, or for China, we can assume they behave properly and then sometimes behave improperly, or they behave systematically improperly and sometimes they do the right thing. That depends now on our default setting, doesn't it?
Yeah, but changes, they always have an interest.
Yes, and it's so what there is behind, and we are not in the offices of the Chinese government or Ministry of Fisheries. That's, because it's a question of strategy at international law, at international level, and why, as I read, so for instance, about the issue of illegal fishing in the UN, they were not very proactive up to now, if not at all, and apparently they show some interest now. So it's perhaps the spirit in the ministry is changing. I don't know. It's I hope that it's that is direction with go on. But.
I have a follow-up question on that, because yesterday Daniel mentioned that China usually will follow the groups or will not stay on the side, and you saw that they did not sign the different UN agreement and the one from on fish. But is it because this agreement happened a few years ago and the change is just very, very new? So is it just a timeline that we don't see change, and these are coming very recently, within 1 or 2 years?
Yes. Perhaps it's different. It's different with the three agreements. I've heard that for the fish stock agreement, China didn't ratify it and didn't sign it because of the provisions for boarding and inspection in the high seas, because it was strictly regulated, and it's this afterwards, so it must be implemented through the RFMOs. But apparently, what I've heard is China doesn't want to be bound by that, China would not like to have an inspector from a third state coming on a vessel, on one of its vessels. The compliance agreement, it's my own assumption. It's an agreement which has up to now only 40 contracting parties, which is not much, and it's the older of these agreements. Perhaps when there will be 50 or 60 agreements, 40 contracting parties, China will become part. And for the FAO Port State Measures, it's a rather recent agreement. So it was adopted in 2009. The ratification in the for 5 years were increasing very slowly, and suddenly it was in 2015 and 16 there has been 10 or 15 ratification, and as 25 contracting parties were needed for its into force. So the number of 25 was quickly reached, and it has increased. And now, which number is it? I don't remember which number I said. Now it's 53. Ooh, it's incredible. Huh? I remember, so as I followed this agreement since I participated to the negotiations, I was more pessimistic than that. But it has increased, as I said, in the years 2015 in particular and 16. Perhaps it was a consequence of the EU action with its regulation against illegal fishing. And perhaps we can hope that China will ratify that one in not in a long time now. So we'll see. It would be a sign.
I would like to make a comment about the EU agreement. It looks very good. The agreements are all public, and they have increasing content. They cannot make agreement with governments that break human rights and so on. So it looks really good. The agreements are increasing in quality and coverage. I had a student doing a PhD on 600 agreements, mainly from the EU, and examining them.
600?
Yeah, from the European Union, between countries. That covers a year, 1 year, and one party is on one agreement. There are 600 units. Let's call it units.
Vessels, you mean?
Pardon?
Vessels?
No, not vessels. A year between a country and another country, so that we have 600 of those units. And this was mainly European agreement, but also some others that we got our hands on. And the European agreements were increasing quality in depth and everything, except in one crucial factor, the coverage by observers. While the quality of the extent and the reach of the agreement, the coverage and the protection of the observers on board was declining. And that is equivalent to a large number that you multiply with a zero. Because if you have no observer on board, the boat can do whatever they want. And while the agreements were getting more and more better for the countries involved and everybody is happy getting more money, actually the observer coverage and the protection of the observers, especially in West Africa, has declined. And that means the boats that are sent from Europe can do whatever they want. And they do whatever they want, including legal fishing, because they have no observer on board, or because the observer are corrupt, or intimidated, or thrown overboard. And that happens on a gigantic scale. It's not a joke. It actually, the observer program goes down, and the quality of the agreement goes up, but it's like a long series of numbers that you multiply with zero. If there's no observer program, you can forget about everything else.
I don't know the details, so you have studied that. I have not studied that, so you are certainly right. And
it was done by a Breton, by a young man from Brittany, Lamanac.
Okay, I think we have another question.
I have a question about flags of convenience. So you mentioned like flag states, and so like when a vessel is flying a flag of convenience where it's like it has a flag of another country, like whose responsibility is it to like monitor that vessel? And if the vessel is from the EU and are supposed to have like a number of laws apply to it, but are flying the flag of another country, like what happens when they're doing that? And does China have a stance against their vessels flying like flags of convenience?
First of all, it's an issue because you have EU vessels and Chinese vessels under flags. I must say, vessels which belong to Chinese or nationals of EU member states, which are under flags of convenience, and this is allowed by international law. There has been a case in ITLOS, in the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea. It was 3 or 4 years ago. It was a Virginia J case. There was that vessel which was under Panamanian flag, which was arrested by the authorities of Guinea-Bissau, and Guinea-Bissau said that as Panama is a flag of convenience, it has no genuine link with that country, but the tribunal said that what is required under the Convention of the Law of the Sea was complied with by Panama because it was registered. All what a registering country must do was done, and nothing else could be done. But beyond of that, in the EU basic regulation now, and member states must take measures against nationals of the country when they do illegal fishing through by means of vessels flying other flags. And this last year, Spain has taken strong measures against vessels which flag different, many flags, I must say. No. And so it's an issue. It's still an issue, but it's something more must be done. But it's something going on, and there will be. It's in progress, I would say. It's a fight. It's a continued fight.
I just wonder whether, from your perspective, there are differences in terms of interpretation. How China perceive or understand illegal fishing differently from the European countries. For instance, in the case of China, you have ongoing maritime dispute in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and the Yellow Sea. Even in the Yellow Sea with South Korea, as Professor Colley has mentioned, there were ongoing problems. So from Chinese government's perspective, some activities, for instance, the Chinese fishermen that go to the South China Sea to the specialists, perhaps for other countries it's illegal fishing, but under Chinese domestic law, it's perfectly legal for the fishermen to go there. So there are very different understandings of the term illegal fishing or illegal fishing in the Chinese context.
He meant illegal fishing mainly in Africa, and the claim of the exclusive economic zone of China's economic zone fortunately doesn't reach to Africa.
Yes.
Two brief comments and a question. My first comment is, it seems to me, as you indicated at the end of your presentation, there's a kind of change of mindset in China, at least amongst some segments of the society. You've got this well-known basketball player, Yao Ming, who mobilized a number of people against eating shark fins, you know. So there is an ongoing battle in China itself against, in order to protect endangered species. But I'm wondering whether you've seen also a relationship between this growing awareness in China, although it's just starting, and the fact that China is now much more involved in the fight against global warming. You know, China is one of the parties of the Paris Agreement of 2015, and do you see any connection in that? And my other question is, you haven't mentioned the existence of a dialogue between China and the EU on fishing, on fisheries. Can you, either a kind of dialogue on those issues? Have you been involved in this dialogue? And can you tell us more about it, if it exists?
Yeah. On the first thing, if there is a link with climate change, I think that so it's not an opinion as a lawyer, it's what I observe as any citizen. It seems that China has become aware of that all these problems are all connected, and China must participate in it everywhere. I think it's not more complicated as that. On the other problem, the relationship between China and the EU for the fight against illegal fishing, there has been what is called a high-level dialogue about illegal fishing. I've not been involved in that. And the only thing I know, by the way, is the press release which was put on the official website of the EU delegation in Beijing. I know nothing more. And it was set up in 2014 or 15, I don't remember. And I don't know whether there has been meetings within this high-level dialogue, bilateral, which was set up. I don't know.
Okay, thank you. So I just a comment from an earlier question, and then a question for yourself. There's a question earlier about motivation, and I think a couple of speakers actually did talk about the eco-civilization, which is part of the 13th five-year plan. So I think there's an important shift within China, as far as I can understand, about considering environment much more, and the marine component is an important part of that. But my question to yourself, and maybe some of the other speakers who talked about legality of the vessel activity, particularly sort of spatial, from a spatial perspective, and that is, I haven't heard anyone really talk about VMS, monitoring systems. Now we have a lot of technology on a lot of these boats, and many countries do require boats in their waters, maybe of a larger size at least, to have VMS on them. It just seems that there's a lot of potential for using monitoring systems to see where boats are going. As part of these general management plans, but I haven't heard much about this. And sort of related to technology, recently I came across a very nice little project being done in Indonesia, and this goes back to something that Daniel said, which is they have it's almost like a 360 degree camera. I'm not sure if it's fully all the way around, but you can put that strategically on some boats. maybe on the landing decks, and actually watch what's going on. It's a really, really sophisticated system. And so that sort of puts an observer at some level at least back on board. And it just seemed, my point being, just seems that there is a lot of potential for using the technologies we have today to really fill in some of these major, major gaps in terms of understanding what these vessels are doing and where.
Yeah. So this technology is used in the EU. The first obligations for having VMS on board dates back from 1998 or 99, I think. And now all vessels over 12 meters, if it's not 10 meters, must have a VMS system on board. Concerning CCTV system on board, it was put in the last control regulation 2-3 years ago, I think. But I don't know the details at which point there is obligation about that. There is some obligation, but frankly, I don't know the details.
My
In Canada, we have it.
I understand in some parts of the world, but my point being that within this region, there's a lot of potential for that, for those approaches, to address some of the concerns and issues that have been raised in this region, in Asia, within Asia, East and Southeast Asia.
Yeah, but all over the world, in all the regions, and this system, of course, CCTV system, in particular, it addresses problems with big vessels, first of all.